A forest awakens with the dead. A jogger finds too much escape in his evening routine. Bugs adore a young girl when no one else does. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Is anybody else's family like this? I mean, really? Does anyone have problems like me? My mom couldn't have waited just 1 second, just one more moment to see if we made it inside the movie theater okay? Why couldn't she wait? I don't get it, Will said to himself. He was tall, pale, with poorly cut hair that matted over itself in sweaty summer curls. He was wearing a blue polo with a red stripe through the center and khaki shorts. He was tall but had poor posture, so no matter what, if he wanted to feel big, he always seemed small. He was wearing flip-flops which snapped on the pavement like teeth. I guess you always wanted to know how long it would take to walk from high school, so here you go. Granted, the movie theater's a bit further away than Irondale, Darius said. He was shorter, of Indian descent with black hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a small assortment of acne on his face. His mom had gotten him a special medication for it at night, which meant he couldn't drink soda after 10 p.m. He wondered if she realized how tedious that was. Darius was wearing a Secret of Mana t-shirt with black shorts. His body was growing quickly. He'd just entered high school, and there'd only be a few more months left of being able to fit into that novelty shirt. Will was jealous of the shirt, not because he also loved Secret of Mana, but that Darius was so bold to wear his actual interests on his sleeve for everyone to know. I didn't want to find out by my mom abandoning us at the movie theater. They really should have had signs up on the windows saying their power was out. It's bad enough that I haven't watched The Phantom Menace yet, and it's been out for 2 whole months already. But when I finally do get to Windsong and the whole fucking theater is out of commission, Will said. He waved his blue lightsaber back and forth like an angry bug. Yeah, I'll admit I'm surprised your mom didn't wait. She literally pulled out of the parking lot the exact moment they wouldn't let us in. You couldn't have timed it better, Darius said. He was walking briskly ahead of Will, holding his lightsaber confidently over his shoulder. It was shortly after 3. It was the typical summer day in suburban Minnesota. Quiet, hot, with long shadow clouds mixing with billowing trees. The air was a mix of sour grass and sweet lilacs. Cicadas grumbled from the branches and rooftops. Well, at least we're only a few blocks from Hidden Oaks, which means we're almost home, Will said. He was only positive when he had to protect the mistakes of his parents. Darius suddenly tripped on a small crater in the pavement. His foot dragged into it, throwing him forward. He let out a garbled scream and threw his arms out cartoonishly. Both Darius and Will were currently obsessed with anime. Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, and Record of Lodoss War were a few they had devoured. Due to their ravenous fandom, Darius had actually adopted the exaggerated gestures of his favorite characters, which made the tumble even more comical. You all right? Will said through muffled laughter. Yeah, just shut up, okay? I think I cut my foot with a pebble, Darius said. He rocked back and forth like his entire lower leg had been removed. He shook his head like his brain needed to catch up with his body and stood up in a sweaty flourish. It's not so bad. At least we're getting closer to home, he said. A few crows cackled above them on some power lines. They agreed. The street they were walking along was 29th Avenue. Will lived towards the end of it, and Darius just a few blocks further from that. The road would turn into a T just past Hidden Oaks Park, some tennis courts, and a small green square of woods they called Snaketooth Pass. The forest had absolutely nothing about it that resembled a snake's tooth, but Will, who had named it when he was younger, didn't care if there was some common physical distinction to give the trees this title. It was simply what he called it. It was a green gem from his more innocent days. We can just try seeing the Phantom Menace again soon. Hopefully before anyone ruins it. We'll have to continue to quarantine ourselves, Will said. Yeah, well, people from the Otaku Wars have specifically been avoiding me to preserve the movie, so we'll have to see it soon. This is getting ridiculous, Darius said. He was limping slightly as they continued to walk. On either side of the boys were rows of empty houses. It was a Thursday. Will's mom had used her lunch break to give them a ride to the theater. People were just starting to get home from work. Garage doors were echoing across the lawns as people parked. They were about a block from Hidden Oaks when they noticed 3 figures biking down the road ahead of them. The sunlight blinded Will for a second, and he arched his hand over his eyes. Shit, it's Ty and Clement, he said. What, you serious? Said Darius. Yeah, and worse, Aubrey's with them. Not Aubrey. Yeah, Aubrey. Let's just turn around and take a different street back. They'll catch us. Let's try cutting through Snaketooth Pass. Maybe they won't follow us in there on their bikes, Will said. Oh, Will, there are bike trails inside there, said Darius. Will quickly crossed the street and slightly jogged toward the woods, which started after a blue Rambler with a black rooftop. Who cares? Run, he said with a shout. Snaketooth Pass was an unremarkable streak of forest. It was one long rectangle of leaves, trunks, moss, and random dirt paths crisscrossing through the greenery. There were a few token bike trails for people to use, but the pavement was cracked and scaly like a dragon's back, so it was bumpy and dangerous. There was also a small pond that sat in the forest with a slimy skin of foamy algae. Around it was a thin layer of cattails and reeds, with a few trees that hung over the edge of the water. When he was younger, Will thought they looked like vultures from some wasteland you'd see Wile E. Coyote or the Roadrunner sprinting through. Perhaps the only interesting thing about Snaketooth Pass was that in the center of a tiny blob of brown water was an island, completely unattached from the surrounding dirt and roots. It had tall, uninterrupted grass growing out of it, like nobody had set foot on it. The reeds were so high, it made the island stand up higher than it should. In truth, the moon itself was more well-traveled than this random dot of greenery floating between dragonflies. Will and Darius were through the trees lining the street in just a few short seconds. They assumed the bullies had seen them dash inside. Will was ahead of Darius. He knew the woods a bit better than him despite being directionally challenged and needing Darius to lead him home from the movie theater. The woods were quiet, buzzing with mosquitoes and stinky from the pond water that centered the trees. A dirt path ran through the woods like a scribbled line. It emptied at a small hill next to some tennis courts just a few 100 feet away. Their best bet was to exit the woods before Clement, Ty, or Aubrey could say a single word to them. They were panting, but making good time dashing along, green lines of plants and trees, when Darius stopped to stare into the underbrush. What the hell are you doing? We gotta go, Will said, putting his hands on his knees between breaths. Look at that. What is that? A cat? He said, pointing at a dark mass mixed in with the leaves. Will staggered over. On the ground was a severely decomposed feline spread out on its side, like it was taking a nap. It looked like it had gray fur when it was alive, but now its skin and hair were mixed into its reddish, jelly-like skin. Its eyes were closed tightly. Along its side were lesions that had been strangely sewn up with small stitches. It looked like someone had tried needlepoint with a cobweb on it. The woods seemed to get perfectly quiet while staring at it, like reality was looking over their shoulder. What the fuck you faggots looking at? A shrill female voice said from down the path. Will turned to find Ty, Clement, and Aubrey walking toward them. Their bikes were tangled in a pile just outside the forest on a hill. Some vines were slowly crawling over them, but they were too vicious to notice. Shit, Will said to himself. There's a dead cat over here, Darius said, pointing. You should fucking kiss it. You're so goddamn ugly, that's about the only thing that would love you, Aubrey said, walking past. She ripped a small tree branch off a verdant pillar dangling over the path and walked over to the cat. Aubrey was short, with brownish hair which sometimes had a purple glow to it in the sun. She was thin, pale, with long eye circles that crowded her narrow face. She was wearing a pair of jean shorts with a white shirt with the Looney Tunes logo on it. She was actually pretty, in a very gentle way, which made her frightening personality even sharper. She was the worst bully around because you couldn't hurt her back, no matter how vicious she was. "What are you guys doing out walking around anyways? Shouldn't you be in your basement playing video games?" Clement said. He was tall, almost as tall as Will, with blonde hair, a large nose, and long arms that he used to punch people with when they turned their back to him. He was wearing some shorts and a white shirt as well. He hadn't intentionally dressed like Aubrey, but he did like her. She was the only girl who enjoyed hanging out with him. "What are you talking about, Clement? You're in the basement as much as we are, you shithead," Will said. He was big enough to fight Clement and Ty if he wanted. He wasn't a fighter, though. Every time he had used his strength, he felt immediate regret afterward. It wasn't worth it to him to hurt anyone. Ty, who was short, pale, with bleached hair and an earring, and also wearing a white shirt, stood on his toes next to Clement's ear and loudly whispered some gibberish while staring at Will. "What? What are you saying, Ty? At least be brave enough to speak, you weasel," Will said, walking forward with his fists clenched. A pine cone smacked into Will's ear as he faced the boys. He yelped and wobbled to the side. Aubrey laughed and pushed past him to examine the corpse. "You're terrible, Aubrey." "You okay, Will?" Darius said, running over to comfort his friend. Clement jumped and tripped him with his foot, causing Darius to topple into Will. Clement was on top of them before they could move, dragging them towards the dead cat. "Give it a kiss, you faggots," he said with a laugh. A few earwigs darted out from beneath the still form of the animal, causing Will to jump to his feet. They looked like lost pieces of black mercury looking for a thermometer. They swam beneath the dead leaves of the forest floor and vanished in seconds. A sudden gust of wind threw the trees into a deafening roar. It was so intense, the bullies looked around at the leaves to try and understand it. This was Darius and Will's chance to get away. They jumped to their feet and ran back down the path they'd walked from, towards the small opening of pavement light next to the road. Something strange happened as the two boys made for the exit. The forest seemed to stretch out as they moved. It was like they were sprinting inside a green tunnel which was getting pulled further away from them like a rubber band. They were running too fast to look at each other, but if they could, it'd be looks of unbelievable concern. There was also a strange feeling that something was directly behind them as they dashed. Not Ty, Clement, or Aubrey, but something else entirely. A force that triggered some sort of primitive instinct deep in their core. A sound started to echo up from the rows of trees and leaves as they breezed by. It was hollow, yet melodic. It sounded like wind chimes, but emptier, like bones brushing against one another. Then, in one instant, Darius and Will burst through the woods like living corks. They were in the middle of the street, stomping on the pavement. Darius was still holding his lightsaber. It had been clenched into his hand like an extension of his body. They leaned on their knees and panted like they'd just run the mile in gym class. A few bumblebees bounced across the summer breezes as they gasped, uninterested in the supernatural drama the humans had just experienced. What the hell was that? Did that just happen?" Will said, straightening his back. "I guess we took a wrong turn or something," Darius said. He stared down his lightsaber, making sure it wasn't damaged. "It took us a small eternity to get out. What was taking so long?" "Run! Run! The cat's alive! The fucking thing's alive!" a voice screamed from the woods. In just a few moments, Ty, Clement, and Aubrey tumbled out of the woods in a sweaty pile, falling on the curb in a heap. The goddamn cat was alive! It scared the hell out of us," Clement said, standing up. "It fucking bit me right on the hand. I thought you faggots said it was dead," Aubrey said. Clement tried to help her get to her feet, but she waved him away in a streak of bloody fingers. "You might want to disinfect that," Darius said. "Fuck you," Aubrey said. A blaring siren hit the air around them. It was piercing. Darius and Will were still standing out in the street when the sound started blasting. Darius quickly grabbed his friend and threw him onto the curb next to the bullies. An ambulance blasted by in a flashing square of lights and beams. It hadn't slowed down at all for the kids. It was obviously occupied with whatever medical crisis propelled it down the street. What was strange about the way it appeared is that the sound to it sort of echoed, like the area around the forest was trailing behind everything else that was happening in time. Reality was delayed in some strange way. "That was a close one," Darius said. He watched the bullies maul past him and back around the forest to where they'd parked their bikes. "We'll see you bitches later. You got lucky today with all this shit happening. We'll take a rain check, but don't think you're safe. You're just lucky a bunch of weird-ass stuff just happened," Clement said. He punched Will in the arm as he strutted by. Will was too in shock to really care. Ty didn't say anything. Aubrey just held her bloody hand as she walked and looked down at her feet. "Watch out for that fucking cat," Will said as they retreated. "You're dead, WOL, she said. "What does that mean?" Darius said. "Waste of life," Will said with a shrug. Later that evening, long after the kids were gone from the edges of the forest, a cat wandered out from the underbrush and crossed the street, where the ambulance had dashed by earlier that day. The woods had grown thicker and denser as it left, like something was trying to hide itself. Its fur was cleaner now. It had spent the afternoon licking it. The stitches on its body had revitalized its skin and joints, so it moved normally. The only thing that her skills couldn't cure were the eyes, which were still a milky white of death, like it had stared too far into the underworld before it was brought back into this time and place. The cat found a ledge of rocks below a tall hill just beyond the forest. It sat there licking its paw and thinking. How long would it be until she fully arrived? The late afternoon sun blazed its white, hot light. Driving home, Guy was already pissed from his terrible day at work. Terrible week, really. And the bright day on his sensitive eyes just made him more angry. No, angry wasn't really the right word for it. Guy always thought of this feeling as prickly. That's what he called it anyway, when it came up at home. On top of that, he had been in meetings all day for the past 3, and not the good kind, if that even exists. The kind that made him feel greasy. And greasiness always made the prickliness worse. When he felt like this, physical touch, another person trying to connect with conversation, anything with other people really, just made him bristle and push away. It made him irritable, and he realized it made him treat the people close to him poorly. Guy had figured this out about himself some time ago, and luckily, he had also discovered the cure for these feelings. Jogging. It didn't matter how he felt, prickly, greasy, angry, depressed, lost. Going for a jog always replaced those feelings with peace. It was his prescription, his solution, his meditation, his therapy. Today, when he got home, it was going to be the first thing that he did. He turned left off Silver Lake Road onto 15th Street and into his driveway. The second on the right. He pushed the garage door opener he kept on his sun visor, but the garage door only opened about 5 inches and then stopped. And when he pushed the button a few times more, nothing happened. Of course, just something else to go wrong today, Guy thought. He also thought it was weird how several electronics that he owned had been acting strange lately. The TV remotes weren't working all the time, and through the kitchen phone and radio, he had been intermittently hearing odd static, like the tinny voices you hear over the police scanner. There was a National Guard unit that drilled not that far away, off Highway 10. The first time he heard it, he chalked it up to that, but now it was the middle of the week. It didn't really matter. Stuff like that was pretty common anyway, and his remotes and garage door opener probably just needed batteries. No big deal. He could open the garage door with the emergency pull cord after his jog and park inside then. He slipped out of his work clothes, threw them into the hamper, and walked into the bathroom. With the warm water over his face, followed by the greasy feeling being scrubbed away by the clean, fresh soap, he felt his prickliness drop down at least a few notches. but it was time to take it down to zero. He put on his work clothes, clipped his Walkman to his belt, and on the way to the door, he grabbed the sunglasses he had left on the kitchen counter that morning. After he slipped into his tennis shoes and stood up, he looked down. He could see his socks through the hole in his shoe by his right big toe. Wiggling his toes, he thought it was probably time to buy a new pair. Maybe he would this weekend. He stepped out the front door, paused on the front step to turn on the Walkman, and he jogged out onto the street and took a right. As he jogged, the summer air washing across him was even more cleansing than the soap and water he used to scrub away the greasy feeling from his face. Every time his feet struck the pavement, he felt himself grow closer to his zen, his flow, and get farther away from the frustrations of the day. He felt all the negativity slip away as he became one with the exercises. Each time a foot pushed off the ground, he was farther from the feelings that made him bristle. He smiled as "I Go to Extremes" by Billy Joel came on the radio. He liked this song a lot, and it made the flow of the jog even more complete. For the most part, he kept his eyes on the ground a few feet in front of him. Mostly turned inward, his focus was not on anything around him, just the music, his feet striking the ground, and the way his muscles felt as he pushed forward. As he got to the curve in the road where 15th Street becomes 28th Avenue next to the park, something changed. He couldn't exactly put his finger on it. The radio babble static and vague voices came back into his ears like it had been more frequently lately, and he felt a strange feeling wash over him. Something he couldn't quite describe, but that was like a queer sense of dread. He normally ran on the oncoming traffic side of the street, but he felt compelled to cross to the other side. Something about the dread feeling seemed to push him away from the park. The farther he got down 28th Avenue, past the end of the park, the feeling passed. He crossed back to his usual side of the street, and Billy came back clearly into his headphones. Guy jogged on. He knew this would be a long jog. He needed it today. And really, he didn't want it to end. He took a left down 16th Street and wound his way around through the neighborhoods for hours. He didn't know how long he had been jogging. The batteries in his Walkman had died, and he usually used songs to judge the passage of time on his runs. The sun had set, and it had grown dark by the time he came up 29th Avenue. He was going to have to jog past Hidden Oaks again, but this time in the dark. The way he felt earlier when he was going alongside that spot gave him a little pang of worry. Looking up as he jogged, he noticed the street light must have been out at the corner of 29th and 16th. He could usually see where the street was, and he felt like he had been jogging along the park for a while now. Continuing to jog, he came back to himself, out of his jogging bliss. That creeping, vague dread had begun to return. It was dark, very dark. Way too dark, Guy thought, for being in the middle of the suburbs. Even if the streetlight was out, there were still others down the block and houses. And where were their lights? For the first time he could remember on a jog, Guy slowed his pace and started to look around. There were woods on both sides of the street, and no end of the road or cross street in sight. He hadn't realized how lost in his run he had become. He was sure he had been on 29th Avenue, but now, looking around, he had no idea where he was. He would turn back and jog the way he had come until he figured it out. He had had an off day and got more engrossed in his therapy than he usually did, that was all. He jogged back the way he had come only a few minutes before. When what felt like 10 minutes had passed and he hadn't passed another house or a side street or anything that he even remotely recognized, the vague sense of dread he had been feeling flashed quickly into fear. It hadn't been that long since he had turned onto this road. He had no idea where he was. In front of and behind him, the road simply stretched straight ahead of him, with nothing but indistinct forest on either side rolling ahead into the darkness. He quickly turned around and started to jog back the way he had come yet again, his heart beating faster in his chest. His prescription, for the first time in his adult life, was failing to make him feel better. He began to jog faster, until now he was moving at a full-on run. As the road unfolded in front of him, with no end in sight, he knew it was time to stop and find his bearings. He couldn't let himself start to panic. What he was observing couldn't be happening, wasn't possible, not on suburban streets. And that was when his fear turned into outright terror. For though Guy's mind was telling his legs to stop, they wouldn't. His body just kept running down the dark, forested road, absolutely separate from the control of his brain. Apparently, there was one thing he could do, however, and that was scream. This is exactly what he did. He screamed and screamed and screamed as his body on autopilot ran down an endless road on an endless night through the middle of an endless forest. Aubrey wasn't initially worried about the bite on her hand. The cat had really sunk its teeth into her right hand. She'd figured it would just puncture her pale skin, but the attack was so violent, it instead gouged her flesh open like a strip of tape. When she watched the two losers, Will and Darius, scatter and run away like a couple of minnows in some shallow water, she caught some movement next to her feet. Before her eyes could focus or even move, the cat clamped onto her hand. When it bit her, something strange happened to her hearing. She could hear hundreds, if not millions, of random heartbeats all around her. She felt like she was at the center of some sort of web or highway, but also that someone was watching her. Then the pain hit, and she screamed and ran out of the woods, followed by Ty and Clement. Aubrey was more worried about how her father's dog might react to blood dripping off her body. She was worried that the dog might taste it on her clothes or the floor, and maybe go after her in some primal bloodlust. Ricky already disliked her immensely, even though she'd known him for 6 years, or ever since her mother passed away. She took deep breaths and relaxed herself as she walked along the road towards her house. The air was hot, green, and buzzing with traffic and mosquitoes. The drips of salty crimson liquid leaking out of her hand wasn't completely obvious to people driving by or riding their bikes, but the shock in posture certainly was. She couldn't even walk in a straight line. Was it really too much to ask for one stranger to wonder about her, for someone to actually care about how she was doing? Even a bloody wound wouldn't help with that, she thought. Aubrey reached home before her dad got back from Honeywell. He was a machinist there, but he'd often stop at Joe DiMaggio's, one of the local watering holes, before walking in the front door. Her house was a bit strange for such a typical, cozy suburban neighborhood. It was up a high hill away from the street. The driveway was a long yellow tongue of gravel surrounded by pine trees, with a red rambler at the end of it. The perch of her household made the rest of the world lower, distant, like Aubrey was being kept isolated away like a princess from a fairy tale. She didn't think her father was doing it intentionally. He just liked his privacy, and there was no way he'd ever move. This is where they were with Mom, after all. Aubrey got up the driveway and the concrete steps fine enough. She went to the front door, which was black with metal letters on the front. She began to go inside, but Ricky immediately bashed against it and snarls and barks on the other side. She expected him to do that and slowly open the door through the onslaught. When she got it open enough to reach a hand through, she pulled a salt shaker out of her pocket. She tossed it into Ricky's face with a flourish, which caused the dog to yelp and run away from the entrance. Ricky was a light brown Doberman and Rottweiler mix, with a blind left eye. He'd gotten that blindness before Aubrey's father had adopted him, so she wasn't guilty of that damage. She didn't like hurting the dog, but it never liked her. It scared her, especially when her dad wasn't around to restrain it. "Just don't back down or be scared. He can sense fear. You've got to toughen up," her dad would say in his high voice from behind a beer bottle's neck. She entered the home and went directly to her room. Her dad rarely cleaned the house. The living room, kitchen, dining room, and hallways were full of empty bottles, piles of newspapers, and random boxes of junk her father refused to throw away. Her room was the cleanest. It was at the back of the house with a window that beamed out over the backyard, which had a jagged line of forest where deer fed until Ricky would bark at them. Below the square of glass was a pot of flowers her mom had planted. They came back every spring. They were orange and yellow. Her mom had told her what they were when she planted them, but she couldn't remember the name. Aubrey could go downstairs and explore the boxes of her things next to the washer and dryer, but she was worried her father might get mad. She could rent a book from the library also, but that would require too much effort. She'd rather be sad about it. She cleaned the hand off with some rubbing alcohol and washed it multiple times before she holed up in her room. Her dad would probably bring her back some food from Joe DiMaggio's. Typically, it was leftover pizza from the stuff he couldn't finish between Budweisers. Other times, it would be corn dogs with fries and a sad little container of ketchup that she'd never use. The fact that her father was even thinking about her was good. He barely spoke to her anymore. He didn't know what to say to her. Aubrey took some Tylenol to get the wound to stop aching. At times, it felt like things were moving around between her bones and fingers, but she assumed it was just her tissue adjusting to the puncture wounds. She holed up in her room all night. She didn't want her dad to see the injury. She didn't know how he'd react. He could get pissed because he'd have to take her to urgent care. He might not care at all. He might just point at her bandaged hand and ask what happened, but nothing after that. Regardless, it meant talking to him while he'd been drinking, which was a consistent recipe for disaster. The next morning, Aubrey woke up relatively early for summer. She tossed the pink quilt off her bed, which was sideways against the wall opposite the window. Posters of Star Wars decorated the walls. Nobody knew she'd liked the films. How could she tell anyone considering who she tortured and targeted? As she stood up and looked down at her bed, a few bugs dashed away from the covers. They were long, spiked with pinchers on their butts. They had a grayish-brown texture to them, like a bit of dirt and dust had come alive against some magic spell. She'd seen them a few times along the driveway when dead leaves lined it during the fall. "Ugh, you're disgusting. How did you get in?" she said to the bugs. She banged her hands on the mattress, and they scattered away to the dusty crevice beside the bed. "I don't know what you're called, but you're certainly ugly," she said. Aubrey went to the bathroom and immediately began to brush her teeth. Another of the bugs fell onto her from her hair. It was like a wriggling drip of ink as it connected with the sink, squirming around like the white vanity was burning its shell. "Fucking Christ, another one? Are you serious?" she said, throwing her toothbrush at it. Its red plastic looked like blood against the sink. She tried to spit water onto it to flush it down the drain, but her hand suddenly throbbed and there was a sound from somewhere. It was a hollow melody, vaguely musical. A crashing of a door interrupted her. In the living room, Ricky had broken free of the basement again. He did this every single day. Aubrey's father would put him down there during the day, but the dog was smart and clawed the doorknob until it clicked open like a padlock on a picked prison cell. She'd have to yell or throw things at him until he backed down. She finished getting dressed into a pair of jeans and a purple V-neck shirt with some gems on the collar. She tied her dark hair back and applied some eyeliner. She got ready to leave the bathroom and kick Ricky away, but when she opened the door slightly, Ricky was nowhere to be found. She looked around the house and could hear some whining coming from beneath the hardwood floors. "Ricky? Ricky, you there? Where are you now, you dumb dog?" she said. More cries came from beneath the floor. By reflex, it made her lift her feet up like she was stepping in lava. After a few moments of balancing out how upset her father would be with the dog being lost somewhere, Aubrey went into the basement looking for it. Downstairs resembled a cement cave. Along its edges were tools, old bottles of engine oil, and miscellaneous junk piled atop the boxes. The air stunk of soil and mold. For light, there was a single light bulb in the center of the room. When she finally found it and turned it on, after frantically pulling for the string in the complete dark while avoiding various clutter, a part of the walls seemed to move as the glow flashed on. All around her, a sort of black wave washed across the various shelves. She rubbed her eyes for a few seconds, and the room returned to normal. My sight must have been adjusting," she said, wincing. Aubrey could hear more whining from Ricky nearby. She stepped between boxes and piles until she was beneath the wooden stairs she'd just descended. There, pushed up against the wall, was Ricky, trembling. "Ricky? Ricky, what are you doing? What's wrong?" she said. Ricky whined and pushed his curled form into the stairs and bricks. The ceiling and wall ached against the panicked pressure, causing dust to fall on Aubrey's hair and shoulders. "What's wrong with you? Are you stupid? Get out of there," Aubrey said. It was too dark to get a clear view of the dog, but his brown and black fur were trembling so much it was like he was tied to some sort of engine that was making his body bounce up and down. Aubrey just stared at him. Her hardness started to fade, and she could feel concern for the animal starting to overtake her typically callous disposition. "Here, come here now, Ricky. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Just come out of there," she said. She stuck out her right hand, the one wrapped in gauze. The dog howled and crushed himself even further away. Something dark and wriggling dropped off her hand and onto Ricky. He howled and bowled past her in a panting rush, knocking her into some boxes and galloping up the stairs. She could scarcely blink before he was gone completely. "Geez, I wonder what's gotten into him," she said. On her way to speech class, Aubrey continued to replay in her mind the events that had just unfolded. She had to bike to the Moundsview Community Center. It wasn't more than a half-hour ride, but she found it a bit harder today. Her body was extra tired and sweaty in the summer sun. Her hand occasionally throbbed, but for the most part it was just a minor nuisance. Aubrey told her few friends that it was a speech class for performance, like in theater. This was a lie. For most of her young life, she'd suffered from a lisp. At the beginning of middle school, it was fully under control, but she still went to the course once a week. Ms. Susan, the teacher of the course, was a nice older lady who always asked Aubrey about her life after class. She really only went to class for that reason. It gave her something she didn't have. The community center was a brown building with a high-angled roof and square appendages. There was an indoor playground inside of it, which Aubrey still liked, but was too afraid someone from school might see her enjoying it. She was going into high school now. Things had to be more serious. You couldn't be fun anymore. The classroom was a sunny wedge of brick and tan desks in the community center. Throughout the building, everything smelled like chlorine thanks to the public pool. Aubrey sat in the back of the class doing the speaking exercises and occasionally working out of the handbook in front of her. She knew everything perfectly, but there was something about this ritual of attending class that made her feel like she might make it. She might get out of her dad's house and into the world. Afterwards, Ms. Susan, an older African-American woman who always dressed in a suit coat, stopped by Aubrey's desk as people filed out. "How's my favorite student?" she said, rubbing Aubrey's shoulder. She pulled her hand back, then placed it on her forehead. "Holy cow, dear, you're burning up. Are you feeling okay?" she said. She rubbed her face twice just to make sure. "Actually, not really. I was bit by a cat yesterday," Aubrey said. She lifted her bandaged hand up like some sort of sign. As she did, 5 more bugs like the ones from earlier appeared on the desk right where she was resting it. They scrambled under the fluorescent light, running into each other like characters from a cartoon. "Oh, look at that. How did those things get in there?" her teacher said. "Yeah, I've been seeing those things everywhere." "I don't know what they are," Aubrey said, brushing them away from her hand. "Oh yeah, what are those things called again? I can't remember. I know they had some sort of old wives' tale attached to them, like they crawled into your ears or something," her teacher said. "Ugh, gross. I thought they were bad before," Aubrey said, standing up. "You have to get that hand looked at, Aubrey. Cats can carry diseases. You're for certain running a fever. Have your parents take you to the urgent care when they get home from work. This isn't something to mess around with." "Okay," Aubrey said. She put her arm around Aubrey's shoulders as they walked to the door. "God, I really wish I could remember what those things were called." Aubrey barely made it home on her bike. She wobbled like some sort of broken shopping cart. It took an extra hour to pedal up those hills between traffic, pavement, and summer breezes. A few times she noticed more of the bugs running along her bike next to curb and gutter, like they were leading her somewhere. It was hard to trust her eyes with the heaviness of her fever. It felt like her head was going to roll off her body at any moment. When she got to her home, her father wasn't back from work yet. Ricky didn't lunge at the door or bark when she opened it. There was silence in the cluttered house. like sound itself was too afraid to travel between surfaces. Aubrey barely made it to her bed before she passed out. She managed to close the door behind her. She was afraid of how her father might react to this sickness. For someone who didn't really care about anything, if a random event somehow broke up his routine, he'd take it out on her in screams and insults. The last Aubrey remembered before the darkness swimming into her eyelids finally solidified into one solid fog was the coldness of the blankets and pillows beneath her face, and something crawling across her back. The dreams started abstract at first. They were just feelings, sensations of dread, distance, and cold. Then they started to change. They became empty, pulled like Aubrey's mind was trapped in a tunnel getting wrenched in two different directions. She whimpered and wailed to herself as images of trees, bark, blades of grass, dewdrops, dirt, and leaves flowed by her in random jolts, like whatever was showing her this perspective was small, frenzied, and guided by primitive forms of motivation. Something hard bumped against her head and she winced in her sleep. She was awake. Had she been? She could smell exhaust, the sewer, and a random assortment of pollen. She tried to open her eyes, but something was holding them shut. It was moving in her eyelids, wiggling, like it was too small to hold onto those muscles, but was trying anyway. Her body was awake, but her mind seemed sewn shut by something. She tried to scream, but her mouth was wrapped in some sort of silk string. She contorted and twisted, but her hands were also bound in the same soft, strong substance. There was a sting on her forehead, and then suddenly her eyes opened. There was only darkness. A round room surrounded her, with walls of dark smoke. The floor dropped underneath her, and she fell into a yellow prairie of flowing grass and flower. The sky was an uncensored blue. There was an eerie quiet, and nobody was around her. In front of her, just down a hill into a small valley, was a long coil of a river with a massive bridge. There was something walking towards her from under the cobblestone arch, a shape with no real definition. She screamed and tried to run, but it was coming closer and closer. The dream ended. She was awake. She was sitting on that hill just outside the forest behind the tennis courts and next to hidden oaks. It was where she'd been bitten by that cat a few days ago. It was the dead of night. The streetlights threw orange halos onto the empty streets. Moths battered themselves against the craned orbs of illumination. Despite the heat, dark and summer, no mosquitoes approached her in the gloom. Sound seemed suspended, too. It felt like something was watching her from the woods. Then the pain happened. It was in her right arm, just below the shoulder. It was hot, throbbing, like her flesh was being parted from the inside. There was an airy feeling crawling through her skin, like there wasn't any blood or vein protecting her from the outside world. She could feel a pressure on her wrist, like a phantom hand was pulling on her in the direction of the forest. She wrestled against it. She screamed and thrashed. She tried to dig her bare feet into the hill for leverage, but the ground was coated with a layer of squirming bodies. It was them, the bugs from before. She caught a glimpse of their forms in a shift of generous moonlight. It was like she was floating in a mess of gray and brown fluid. Aubrey immediately started smashing the insects beneath her heels. They cracked, popped, and squashed under the pressure of her strikes. She thought she heard screams and voices, like they were talking to her in some lost language. After a few minutes of this melee, the pain in her arm subsided. Aubrey rolled free of the grass and got to her feet. The sound of the night returned around her. Crickets, mosquitoes, the whine of traffic on a nearby freeway was all alive again. Her body felt normal, except for a minor sting from her hand. The woods in front of her seemed to change. It grew, rising from the earth like some sort of haunted gate. A form was emerging from the trees. It was shrouded, a dark cloud with a hood of sorts. It was the same image from the bridge. And then it was gone, lost in memory and fear. Aubrey blinked to make sure she was still alive. She walked onto the street and in the direction of home. She tripped over a small mass of clothes piled in the gutter. The street light caught it just right for her to notice it. One of the items was a work vest you'd see someone on the road wearing while they filled potholes or surveyed land. Something about it made her feel familiar, but she couldn't figure out why. Behind her, lost in the shock of her experience, a few bugs followed along the curled concrete in the shadows where they couldn't be crushed. They'd wait for the right moment to try again. If there was one thing these insects could be in the vast world, it was patient. Just like her. The one who lived inside the woods. The one who'd asked so kindly for their help. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. Episode 1 and Dermaptera were written by Patrick W. Marsh. The Jog, written by Robert Dawn. Story edits by Owen Swerkstrom. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.